Attila's invasion of northern Italy was one of his most lucrative campaigns yet, and it would have an outcome he could never have predicted. It would shape the future of medieval Europe and ensure the dominance of the Roman Church. But at this stage, Attila was eyeing up the church for the booty it could offer.
What he's trying to do is make up for the previous year, give his army a few victories and a series of great paydays. And that's basically what they do. They go through northern Italy ransacking the place.
The Western Roman Empire was crumbling, and the city of Rome was a depopulated shadow of its former glory. For some 40 years, the emperor and his government had been based in Ravenna, in northeastern Italy. Much of Rome itself was a rat-infested ruin. But it was the home of the Pope, who would eventually restore Rome's supremacy in Europe. At the time of Attila, though, the Pope of Rome was far from preeminent in the Christian world.
In the year 450, there are 4 or 5 centres of Christian authority which are more or less equal, and Rome is only one of them. Now, popes had been talking big for centuries about how important they were, but they weren't believed outside of Rome. They were considered one of the 5 preeminent sees, but not the most preeminent by any means, nor was papal authority recognised in any serious sense outside of the immediate vicinity of Rome.
When Attila and the Huns marched into northern Italy, they headed straight for the commercial heart of the Western Empire, Aquileia. This was now one of the largest cities in the Western world. These ruins are all that remain of the city walls and the commercial centre, after a 3-month siege by the Huns. They were linked to the sea 7 miles away by a network of canals, making it the busiest port on the Adriatic coast. The story goes that Attila finally broke the defence by building a ramp of horse saddles against the walls. His horsemen then charged up onto the ramparts. Attila then sacked Aquileia so comprehensively that there was nothing left, and the city was never rebuilt. These magnificent mosaics are all that survive of Aquileia's vast 2nd century cathedral, which Attila burnt to the ground. The ashes and the ruins covered up the cathedral floor for almost 1,500 years. It's the largest early Christian mosaic in Western Europe. The scorch marks on the floor show where the burning roof timbers collapsed, grim testimony to the destructive force of Attila and his Huns.
At the time of Attila, the Roman Empire had been Christian for 150 years. The Christian God was worshipped openly and glorified in church buildings, in many cases generously donated by local benefactors.
These donors had advertised their faith and their wealth by decorating the church with their own portraits, but their descendants were shown no quarter by Attila's army. The few who escaped the rampage fled for their lives into the marshlands on the coast and founded the town that would become Venice. So without realizing it, Attila helped to establish one of the jewels of Christian Europe. But Aquileia was only the first city on Attila's hit list. He marched on through Padua, Verona, Bergamo, Milan, all razed to the ground. The citizens offered no resistance and hoped for mercy. In vain. The choice choice Attila offered was enslavement or slaughter. They might have wondered where the Roman legions had got to. But Attila's enemy, Aetius, simply couldn't raise an army. That was how bad things had got.
Something I personally have found a very interesting possible analogy with the collapse of the empire so easily in the 5th century AD is what happened to the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire with the fall of communism. We have something that in 1980 was seen as a tremendous superpower with conventional and nuclear armaments which threatened invasion, we thought, of the whole of the West. And then within 10 years, the whole facade has gone. And I think the reason, probably in both cases, the Soviet Union and Rome, is what had happened over the preceding decades and in Rome's case centuries. The eating away from within of the husk, the outward appearance of Roman power by corruption, by civil war, by increased taxation, increased oppression and so on. To the point where there was utter demoralization. Even soldiers who were in the army didn't want to fight. They would cut off their thumbs rather than go into the forces. And when you get to that sort of situation, it doesn't matter how many forces you theoretically have, how much territory you theoretically control. One push and the whole facade comes crashing down.
Aetius had been caught completely off guard. He thought he'd seen Attila off for good the previous year. All he could do now was send a top-level delegation to sue for peace. He hoped an unarmed civilian from Rome could do the trick. Pope Leo.
For Pope Leo, the meeting with Attila was of fundamental importance. It was another proof of the power of the papacy. It allowed Leo to present himself not only as the preserver of Christianity, but as the saviour of the whole of Western Europe.
Pope Leo met the King of the Huns in the foothills of the Alps, west of Milan. Somehow he did it. He persuaded Attila to leave them in peace and head back home. Rome was safe. For Attila, the reality was that winter was on its way, his supplies were low, there was disease in his army, and the Pope's gold was quite persuasive. For Pope Leo, it was a huge propaganda coup. With God's help, he turned back the king of the heathen Huns. The Roman Church was quick to exploit it. The story spread that St. Peter and St. Paul had paid an unscheduled visit, hovering above the peace conference to make sure Attila did what he was told. And by happy chance, they were the very saints that Pope Leo was always bragging about. They belonged to Rome because they'd been martyred there. It proved Rome had supreme authority. Attila planned to return with reinforcements the next year. Or so he thought back in Hungary, as he took a new young bride, Ildiko. He was 47 years old, with a lot of life left in him. But his overindulgent wedding night changed history. By a curious twist of fate, the warrior king met his end not in the battlefield, but at home in his own bed. At the height of his power, the barbarian whose currency had been the blood of other people ended up drowning in his own. Natural causes, they said. Probably a massive nosebleed. But its political consequences were far-reaching. The Christian church emerged triumphant. The cathedral at Aquileia rose up from the ashes. But if Attila had lived, he might have stopped the Roman Christians achieving secure dominance in Western Europe.
If Attila had sacked Rome, then the centre of Christianity would have been displaced, moving eastward to Orthodox Constantinople, and with the fall of Constantinople to Islam, perhaps again northwards to Kiev or Moscow.
In a superstitious age, Attila's sudden death seemed to be God's punishment, and the Pope seemed to be God's agent. He quickly became known as Pope Leo the Great.
had Attila triumphed, there would have been a significant break in the continuity of Western culture. A continuity which guaranteed the close link between present-day Europe and its Roman past. The Romans whose empire and whose faith Attila and the pagan Huns set out utterly to destroy. Had they succeeded, then there's no doubt that the history of Western Europe would have been profoundly different.
After his funeral, Attila's Hun Empire didn't last long. Without his dynamic leadership, it began to break up the following year. And very soon the Huns, who had threatened Western civilization, were scattered to the winds. The Western Roman Empire collapsed altogether 20 years later, but the new power of Rome, in the person of the Pope, was only just beginning.
In a few seconds, a terrorist training camp on the Iraqi border draws the attention of Shootout.